Welcome to another episode of Attitude. I'm your host, Mary Arnott. On Attitude, my guests and I discuss a different topic each time, and sometimes how your attitude is an influence on what you do in life and what decisions you make. I have a very special guest today who made a decision that he wanted to write books. My guest is Hopkinton resident and author Christopher Jennison. Chris has written and co-authored 9 books, which I will ask him about later in the show. I have many questions for Chris and his writing, so let's begin. Welcome, Chris. Thank you for being my guest today.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
There's so many things I want to ask you about, but I thought we might start, since you brought this for us, with your first writing experience, if you want to tell us a little bit about it.
Well, my first writing experience involved a little community newspaper that I created for my friends and neighbors, and this was in 1951.
And I have it here.
And I was 13 years old at the time, and I called it the Sportster. And you may be able to see that I had some uncertain spelling. Panthers, I didn't spell quite right, but it says Panthers sensational play with only 2 men stop the Tigers 24-18. We had, in addition to my uncertainty at spelling, I also had some uncertainty at recruiting people to play, so sometimes we only had 2 people on a team. But we had great fun. It was before the advent of Little League, so we had to have what we call pickup games, and I can remember them to this day, and I'm still in touch with some of the kids that I played with.
Well, this seems like a rather ambitious experience here for a young man to get into and start his own little paper and write. Did you have some encouragement from someone to do this?
Well, my father was a publisher and an author, and 2 of my uncles were writers. My grandfather was a writer, so there was a lot of that activity going on in the house and surrounding me. And it just was just great fun for me to do. I also read lots of magazines, sports magazines at the time, and enjoyed the articles. So I suppose some of this is trying to replicate that style and approach. But a couple of years later in high school, I was a junior, and for some reason I was asked to write a report on a junior varsity basketball game. So I did, and sent it into the what was called then the Rockland County Leader. This was a weekly newspaper, and Rockland County is a suburb of New York City. My dad worked in New York. And evidently the editor of the newspaper thought well enough of it to invite me down to the office, and I stood in front of his desk, and he was a very formal man, and he said, Chris, I'd like you to be the regular varsity reporter for the Rockland County Leader. What do you think of that? And I said, well, I was dumbfounded. I thought it was great. He said, and I'm going to pay you 15 cents a column inch. And I didn't know what that meant, but I started thinking about long-term investments, and I just thought it sounded like a huge amount of money to me. So the only problem was that once baseball season rolled around, I was forced to make a decision between playing baseball or writing for the paper, because the JV games and the varsity games were played on the same day, and I couldn't obviously cover the varsity games. So I had a conversation with the coach, and he said, "Well, Chris," he said, "what's more important, learning to write or playing baseball?" And I thought for a few seconds, well, that's kind of a heavy question,
yeah, for a young man, yeah.
And but I said, well, Coach, I'm sorry, but I'd rather be a writer. So he huffed and puffed, and my senior year, I did make the varsity baseball team, and so I would sit as a substitute. So I would sit on the bench and making notes, but in uniform. And since this was a a weekly paper, there was sometimes a deadline. I would have to actually go down to the newspaper office in my uniform and go running into the paper with my cleats, cutting up the floor, and sit down at a typewriter in my uniform and write the report. One more story from that era had to do with when I finally did get a chance to play, sort of late in the season. We were playing against one of our arch rival teams, and I got up, and to my amazement and everybody else's amazement, I got a base hit and promptly stole second base. So I was full of myself and just thinking that I could do no wrong. The next batter hit a ground ball towards the shortstop, and I took off for third base, completely forgetting that there was a runner already on third base. And I looked at him, and he looked at me. Meanwhile, the opposing team third baseman slapped the ball on both of us, creating a double play and ending a rally.
Uh-oh.
And when I came back to the bench to get my glove, the coach was standing over my glove. And as I bent down to pick it up, he said, "Jennison, you moron."
Oh, no.
And those weren't his exact words, but since this is a family show, I thought...
Yeah, you better keep it.
So I went out to second base, and the first ball hit went right between my legs. And I finished the game by striking out. So then I was faced with the task of writing all this up. And I absolutely poured abuse over me writing the thing. Jennison fouls up between second and third, strikes out to end the game, lets a ball go through his leg. Why is someone like this playing? You know, words to that effect. And I showed it to my dad. He would often edit or read my pieces, and he read it and looked at me and he said, "Is this the way you would write about one of your teammates?" And I thought it was a very valuable lesson in objectivity. Yeah. So I toned it down a bit, and but those were my high school writing memories.
What a difficult thing to have to do, though, to critique your own self and writing your column about your own blunders at that game, huh?
Well, it was difficult, and my first attempt was pretty harsh. So
you obviously grew up in New York.
Yes.
And is that where you wrote your first book? I think you brought it here for us.
The first book.
Wait Till Next Year by Christopher Jennison.
Titled Wait Till Next Year.
Yeah.
That book was actually written when I was living in Wayland, in the Boston area. I was born and brought up in the New York area, and it was a long time before I wrote my first book. That goes back to the mid-'70s. And this particular book was inspired by a book titled The Boys of Summer by Roger Kahn. And I think a lot of people, especially in my generation, will remember that book. It was a book about the Brooklyn Dodgers. And this particular book, Wait Till Next Year, covers the period 1947 to 1957, when, I hate to say this, in a Boston area, when 10 World Series were played in New York out of the 11 seasons I covered. It was also the advent of Jackie Robinson. And the book ends when when two of the New York teams moved to California, the Dodgers and Giants. But it was an exercise in real love and memory of going to games during those times.
Well, I guess that answers one of my questions that I had for you, and that was, after that terrible high school experience on the baseball team and losing that game for them, why would you decide to write about baseball? But I guess you really loved the game.
I did. I collected, as a lot of us did, baseball cards and magazines and books, and I didn't try to play ball in college. I went to Rutgers, and they had a pretty good baseball program, and but I read a lot about baseball and followed baseball closely. So my first writing idea was about baseball.
It sounds like your father was a pretty good person to have around to critique as well, from his experience and obviously wanting to encourage you.
Oh, he was. He was. He could be a stern critic when he thought something was expressed incorrectly or infelicitously. He would say, you know, here's another way to do it, and was of course very encouraging in general. He read the Wait Till Next Year very closely, and told me about some things that were wrong with it. When I submitted the manuscript to the publisher, it got returned to me very quickly saying it needed a major rewrite. This happens a lot in writing and publishing, but it was kind of a blow because I thought it was ready, and he said, no, look, this happens quite frequently, and here's what you need to do to make it a little more lively. And principally, it needed more quotes, more sort of real-time events rather than just reporting on what had happened.
Was your mother also encouraging you from a very early age? I think you had mentioned something about her saving some of your early writings. Oh
yes, well I don't know why she saved the Sportster, but I'm certainly glad after all these years that she did. She tells me that the first baseball game I went to, she was 7 months pregnant with me, so I had a prenatal baseball experience. Maybe that had something to do with my ongoing affection for the game. My dad took my brother and me to lots of ball games at Yankee Stadium and an old stadium called the Polo Grounds, which is no longer standing. But my only regret is that we never went to Ebbets Field in Brooklyn, because that has become in time a kind of revered place. But Brooklyn was a fairly long haul from where we lived. Yankee Stadium and Polo Grounds were, a lot of people don't realize this, we're only about a quarter of a mile away from each other, so we drove there quite a lot. But my mom was also interested in baseball, and would sometimes listen to the games with us. We didn't have television. We were sort of latecomers to television. My parents were great readers, and sort of objected to the idea of television until the late 50s.
Maybe you could tell us about some of the other books that you've written, and you have some of them here. Is there one?
Well, the second book is titled The Fighting Irish.
Oh, let me see.
And that came out, or actually the idea occurred to me a couple of years after the first book came out. Once you write a book, or while you're writing a book, you always say, I'm never going to go through this again. It's just too arduous. But when it's finished and the book comes out, you're ready to tackle something else. And I'm not quite sure why I chose Notre Dame. I didn't go to Notre Dame, and I wasn't a particularly big fan of the school. But I did some research and determined that there were no histories of the Notre Dame football program. So I wrote up a proposal and sent it to a couple of publishers and had it rejected. And finally, about the third or fourth publisher decided it would be a good idea. But they teamed me up with someone who had just written a best-selling book on football to give it a little more visibility. So that came out, I think, about 3 or 4 years after Wait Till Next Year did.
I was going to ask you about that and your experience with getting publishers to look at your work, even consider it. And so it sounds like you said, at least with this Fighting Irish book, you had some rejections with it before they someone
Well,
was
the
willing
first
to do
book,
it?
Wait Till Next Year, was accepted right away, thanks to my dad. He knew an editor at a company called W.W. Norton in New York, said he's a great baseball fan and he's of an age that would appreciate that period. And they did. They took it right away. Said, but that's less the rule. More often, your proposals are rejected 4 or 5 times, as a kind of sidelight. My dad published Jack Kerouac's On the Road after 7 other publishers had turned it down. And of course that book has become a great icon. But The Fighting Irish was finally picked up after several rejections, but that's more the rule than getting something published, especially without an agent, right away.
Well, did you find yourself getting discouraged at any time then, while you were waiting to hear from publishers, or after you had gotten some rejections, or how did you keep your interest and your passion for writing going if you had to face those rejections?
Well, I've given advice to keep trying, and I think that's really what you have to do. Any writer is not get discouraged. Understand that there are lots of publishers, and lots of publishers have different interests. A very good way to proceed is to go to a big bookstore and look at books not necessarily similar to the one that you want to write, but on roughly the same subject matter, and look inside and see if the author has attributed or has given thanks to his or her editor. So you have someone that you can write to personally, and rather than just write, because a lot of the big publishers won't even look at uninvited submittals. So if you actually address a proposal to someone by name, it at least might get looked at.
That's a good tip for someone who's looking at getting something published, as working on something.
Yeah.
Is there another one of your books that you'd like to highlight for us?
Well, there were a couple of books about the Yankees, which maybe I won't talk too much about.
That's all right. We'll forgive you.
In Red Sox Nation.
We'll forgive you for that.
This book, Baseball Math, came about as a result of my work at a publishing company in the Chicago area. And that was actually commissioned. In other words, the publisher invited me to do it because the editor knew that I was interested in baseball. He didn't realize that I flunked elementary algebra in high school, but he thought that a book for middle grade teachers with exercises and activities and lessons that would motivate students or enrich instruction would be a good idea. So that book has gone through about 4 editions since it was published back in the 80s. So that was fun to work on, particularly for someone with such great insecurity about mathematics.
I think, this really gives them something to relate to and apply it. And
yes.
It looks like it would be a lot of fun learning math through something like this.
Yeah,
grades 4 through 8.
It's been quite popular, and I'm told it's been used quite a lot by homeschoolers. I'm very pleased to hear that.
So what are you doing? There's one of your favorites that I want to talk about. I'm going to hold that off on that just a little bit.
Yes.
And ask you a little bit about what you're doing today.
Well, insofar as writing is concerned, I haven't written anything since the Christmas train book you want to talk about later. My wife Nancy and I had an idea a couple of years ago for a series of books for middle grade readers, particularly young men who are not necessarily motivated to to read on a regular basis, but we had to suspend that project because then we got into the middle of moving. And I do have an idea for a children's book in mind, but writers are usually superstitious. If they just have an idea, they don't really talk that much about it. It's some sort of superstition.
Well, you don't have to give away any secret at this point in time.
It shouldn't be a secret, but it's unformed, and I think the fear is that you can't describe it very clearly. So, insofar as other activities, I'm just about to retire from my own publishing work. I'm going to be retiring at the end of June, and begin working on that book and maybe some of the other books that Nancy and I have been thinking about. There's lots to do. I'm going to try to volunteer in the schools working with children. I've done that in the past. Done some tutoring work with youngsters and have enjoyed that a lot.
Well, before we do run out of time, I'd like to talk about this one, All Aboard for Christmas, because I think you had mentioned it was maybe one of your favorites, and it was certainly one of mine.
Well, that book has, despite the fact that all the other books have been on sports, baseball subjects, I think has become my favorite publication. It could be said that it took 40 years to be written. That's not the case. I started collecting pictures and stories about 40 years ago. The actual writing of it only took about a year and a half or so. But it began, I was on a train ride and sitting at dinner, and in a dining car, you're always seated with strangers. And I struck up a conversation with a gentleman and told him that I was a train buff. And he said, well, that's interesting. He said, I work for the New York Central. And we were riding on the New York Central. And he said, I have this booklet of New York Central pictures that I'll send to you. And I thought, well, yeah, maybe he will, maybe he won't. But he did. He sent me this beautiful brochure of New York Central passenger stations and trains and scenes, and several of which had Christmas themes, Christmas scenes. And so I saved the brochure, and for the next, as I say, for the next 40 years or so, started collecting pictures of trains in Christmas settings, in stations decorated for Christmas or inside cars where they were, and collecting articles about traveling at Christmas or train employees working at Christmas.
Here's one. They can get it for you.
And I wanted to have a chapter, of course, on toy trains at Christmas. That's a natural. And my brother and I did have a layout of trains when we were in our when we were young. So it responded to a lot of personal experiences, and I was lucky enough to find a lot of pictures. eBay was a great source of. There are a lot of ads for traveling at Christmas that were available on eBay. So the first time I submitted that, it was sent back to me because I had really anthologized most of the stories that I had read over the years, and the publisher wanted my voice. So I adapted the stories into more of a flow, and including a description of a trip I took with my family to the old homestead in Vermont on an overnight train.
Well, you did that very well, because that's what I loved about this. You weaved the history in, but you weaved your memories in and stories, and it's just a wonderful book. And I know it's by the time this airs, it's going to be a little early for Christmas, but it'll give people plenty of time if they want to look into it, because I think it makes a wonderful book for a family or for a Christmas gift.
Well, thank you. People do love it. They remember, of course, Of course, Christmas is a celebratory time, but they also remember trains very fondly, particularly people of my generation, because train travel was at earlier times much more conventional, and there were individual railroads. It wasn't just Amtrak. There was the Santa Fe and the New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroad, and all with great colorful histories.
Well, I'm sorry to say that we're out of time, because there's so much more I wanted to ask you about in your writing and your books, and maybe thoughts about how to encourage people who are just getting into it. So I'm going to have to invite you back for another show.
Oh, it would be a pleasure.
Yeah, but for now I'll have to say thank you for being my guest.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome. I'm very glad that Chris could share his love and experience for writing. I hope our audience has been inspired to pursue writing if they have a passion for it. Also, please check out Chris's books. With the internet, it is very easy to find and order books he has written. Coincidentally, Nancy Jennison, Chris's wife, is also an author and is currently working on her newest book. Maybe Nancy will grace my show in the near future. I'd also like to thank the HCAM staff and volunteers for making this show possible. Be sure to watch the credits for the names of the very talented people on the HCAM team. And for now, I'm Mary Arnott, signing out with Attitude.